Welcome. Yes, recording in progress. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. My name is Jade Watts. I am really grateful to be your moderator today for our Spectrum of Trans Identities panel. I will first introduce myself fully and then let our panelists introduce themselves as well. So my name is Jade Watts. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the office coordinator here at WCC for the Department of Mental Health and Counseling Services, and identify as non-binary. I like to think of my gender more like a sensitive jock. Maybe he has allergies, maybe he's like, just feeling his way through the world. He wears his hat backwards, but he cries, that kind of thing. That feels like my gender. And so I'm going to pass it off to whoever would like to go next.
I can go. My name is Shaka Mclauden. I'm a professor of media studies and anthropology at Purchase College, SUNY, just around the corner. I use they, them pronouns, and that we'll be talking about that some, but I liked the way sensitive jock. I think that's probably one facet of mine as well. Definitely have allergies, but still have cats, plural.
Yes, I can go ahead. My name is Lucky Hernandez. My pronouns are they, them as well. I am a non-binary queer trans person. If we're describing our gender in more funky terms, I think I've sort of been feeling out non-binary goth girlfriend these past few days, but I am under the understanding that I'm like, it comes and goes. Sometimes I can identify with other genders, but I will always be non-binary. That's just going to be sustained.
Cool, I guess that means I'm here. Hi everyone, my name is Jay. My pronouns are they, he. I don't even know anymore. I identify as transmasc. And I guess like if I have to label things, I feel like I'm more genderqueer than non-binary, which I never actually understood how that could happen until I really dug into my own transition. With hormones and everything, and as I got like more comfortable in my own body, I was like, like there's a reason why I don't just feel like I'm a man or whatever. So for me, I am identify as transmasculine, identify as queer as well, because I can't put a label on my sexuality and all of those things. And I am currently the manager of youth education and prevention at My Sister's Place, which is a DV organization in Westchester County, since y'all are Westchester students. So I wanted to let you know that this resource exists for you as well. And I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Jay. And thank you everyone for sharing a little bit about your gender identity. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I love a goth girlfriend. That just sounds like I'm in there. I'm with that, I love when we get together and are able to use the words that we want to use about our genders. That feels very empowering to me. And so I'm excited to keep going with that. Thinking of trans, that's kind of why we're all here today. And so trans used to mean explicitly transgender. And so that would be a person who just transitions from one binary gender to another binary gender. Now we think of trans more as an umbrella term, so we discussed about, gender queer, non-binary, sensitive jock, that kind of thing. It's more of umbrella underneath the trans label. And so thinking of that as a term that we're using to sort of identify ourselves, people use different language for different reasons, and one trans person can think of their identity very differently than another trans person. I want to know a little bit more about what each of you think about trans. What does trans mean to you? And I'm gonna put people on the spot. And so Jay, since you ended, can you start us this time?
Sure, I would love to do that. And I know that that whole like labeling thing, so I'm rethinking of my identity because there's a park near where I grew up that has labels on the trees and they all have different names. And I combined a few. So like my gender identity is a Princess Musclewood of Heaven. So you can take that what you will, but I think that encompasses my gender identity. You just refresh that memory of mine. But this question really, for me, I actually used to be someone that when I started my transition, I thought that I was like, oh, I identify as male. Like there's only one way to be trans, and that's like to be the opposite of that binary. Because of my own bigotry, my own BS. Right. And I own that and I've grown from that and I recognize that, but that's part of who I was and my development and my growth. But yeah, so I remember people were coming out as like non-binary, they were coming out as trans, but I was like, you're not trans. You're like, that's not trans. That's not what it means to be trans, right? So like this idea doesn't only like happen within cis communities and heterosexual folks, but like within the queer community as well. It's a huge thing within the trans community, even this label, this idea. So that's what I guess that's I've been there. But for me, trans is just someone that like just we don't identify with whatever was given to us, you know, and I think there's such resilience and there's such power in the fact of like being handed something in life and fully recognizing and being like, nah, that's not for me, and embracing that, you know, because I think regardless of if you're out to folks, if you are in spaces and you're like, yeah, I'm trans, I'm this, like that's cool, that's valid, right? There's also folks that like maybe they are like there's an idea of being stealth, which is like you exist within the world as whoever you are, but you're not like outwardly trans about it. And that's just as valid too, you know, because like I don't think there's any one way to be trans. There's people take hormones, some don't, some have surgery, some don't, some whatever it is, changing pronouns, changing names, like there's no one way to do it. And I think that's what the cool thing is, because to be cisgender, to be hetero is I feel like there is only one way that they do things, you know, so it's a little different. So that's my long spiel.
Thanks, Jay. That was really awesome. Lucky, would you like to go next?
Absolutely, Jade. Anything for you. So I have I sort of really love trans people. Like I love them. I find them to be like one of the best kind of people. So what I mean is, on the surface, trans means change from one to another, or one thing to another thing. Doesn't necessarily have to be within a binary. But I really would like to emphasize how much beauty that has. Change, being able to leave a boundary that is that stifles the dynamic nature of humanity, that's wonderful. You're challenged, every trans person is challenging the colonized idea of the gender binary and how strict and rooted in different kinds of oppressions. It just means so much. And that's why I personally think that being trans is just being incredibly beautiful.
That's so like, thank you for that, Lucky. I also love trans people. I think there's something special about, again, like what you said, that moving between a boundary, you know, and if that boundary is a real one or if it's an imaginary one, it's still moving within or between a boundary. So thank you for that. Shaka, can you let us know a little bit more about what you think trans is, what it means to you?
So I'm a scholar of gender and sexuality. And so I have both the felt experience of what that means and the way that that is articulated with my experience as a scholar. And, thinking historically, certainly we can look at the birth of the quote unquote transsexual, right? The first people who are engaging in sex transitions in order to become who they feel they really are. And it's not really until, for me at least, until the early 2000s that I start to really get exposed with trans culture as we understand it a little bit more now, where it's not transsexual, but it's transgender, and transgender is itself, as you said, Jade, a kind of like umbrella, increasingly an umbrella category that articulates a spectrum of identities. And not just that, but as Jay was saying too, that it just sort of describes a spectrum of identities and tensions too, like within and between communities too, whether that's sort of gay male communities or and trans people, or TERFs and trans people, or trans people and trans people, right? That these are not smooth, experience or smooth categories, that they're always kind of under contestation. So for me, I was teaching a class on drag theory and practice in 2015. I started teaching that class. And, although I had identified as queer for 10 or more years, 15 years at that point, I just sort of like over the course of teaching that class for a couple of years, I just was like, you know what? I have a deep spiritual connection to the feminine, like through my spiritual practice. I like disidentify with maleness. And, I never moved through the world being like, I'm a man. I got male privilege because of how I present and express myself in the world. But I was never like, I'm a man. I always had a much stronger identification with women and people who are outside of maleness. And then of course there was a political component too, which was just like, I'm actually in a position where I can be in an environment, be as a teacher, where being out and laying claim to my own non-binary identity could be really helpful for people. And so I did. But yeah, so that's what it means for me. So it has lots of different kinds of meanings, historical, academic, personal, spiritual.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's something always, for me anyway, especially when thinking about queerness and thinking about transness, and studying queerness and transness and theories, it's really interesting to always, for me to have words for what I'm feeling, what my lived experience could look like in theory and academics. And so thank you for bringing that piece into this. I think that's really important. Dana put in the chat too what a TERF is, just so folks know. It's an acronym for trans exclusionary radical feminist. And in my opinion, if you're trans exclusionary, you're not a feminist. But we can go back and forth on that. Boo, exactly. Thank you, Lucky. And so moving a little bit more into academics, moving a little bit more into maybe a theory, but we're really looking at, again, this whole panel is looking at lived experience. I want to talk for a second about intersectionality and the matrix of identities. And so clearly, the trans people on this call right now are not the same. We look very different. We come from different backgrounds. And so it's important to recognize that our genders, as someone who identifies as a trans person, is not going, rather experiences as someone who identifies as a trans person, it's not going to be the same, because there is a complexity of other things that are happening for us. And so Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, which means that there are aspects of a person's identity that sort of come together and make things more complicated, essentially. And so she was a Black woman, she is a Black woman. And so she looks at the systems of oppression that impact her as a Black person and as a woman. And because of those at intersection, she gets impacted as a Black woman also. And so thinking about our trans identities, thinking about transness and gender in general, how it's so, complicated by race and class, ability. I want to kind of ask our panelists if they can share a little bit about when has those other aspects of your identity come maybe head to head or have melded into change your experience as a trans person. I'm thinking about like, that can be an empowering experience, that can be an experience where you felt excluded, but whatever comes to mind first, whatever you want to share today, I think that's gonna be powerful. And so because I picked on Jay and Shaka to go first last time, Lucky, can you take this first this time?
Absolutely, anything for you, Jade. So yes, my experience as a trans person is entirely influenced by my racial identity. I'm an Indigenous Latinx person, and in terms of gender, those two things can really go head to head. If you take the Latinx, my Mexican roots and the Spaniard colonization, the formation of machismo and the sort of upholding of the patriarchy and the strict gender roles of men and the hierarchies of genders, that is a large influence in the culture that I experience as a Mexican person. And I don't want this to ever be taken as that I don't love my Mexican identity. I absolutely adore my Mexican identity. But this is a part of it. And the very interesting part is that my Indigenous identity from northern Mexico, southern Texas. I'm from the indigenous bands of Coahuila, also known as the Coahuiltecans, who historically were displaced, and therefore the actual, the numerous autonomous tribes have sort of been lost to history. However, the gender binary did not exist within Indigenous cultures. So Jay and Jade, you two both know the lovely person named Laura Brown. I was having a conversation with her, and we were talking about my racial identity as an Indigenous person. And I was like, I sort of feel very, very lucky because I see you, Jade. I sort of feel very, very lucky because my culture, my Indigenous culture, has given to me a very large wealth of love and affection for those who are beyond the binary, the gender expanse, if you will. And that ultimately took much more control of my identity, and definitely part of my spiritual connection to that. I was just so fortunate to have that impact on me. And I sort of described it like how these rich kids get like a ton of wealth from their parents, and it just passes on as generational wealth. And Laura Brown was like, oh, well, that's your inheritance. And I was like blown away, because the idea that I have such a needed ancestral inheritance, it's just, it was so moving to me, and it's still moving now thinking about it. And so that's part of my experience.
Thank you so much for sharing, Lucky. And it's moving for me too, just to hear your experience and how your identity sort of mixes and helps you define and really feel your gender in its fullness. And so thank you for sharing. Shaka, would you mind going next?
Sure. So I wanted just to add to that conversation about intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw. So that paper is also the founding text of critical race theory. So all of the discussions that are happening around the country now about critical race theory, and we can't teach our kids critical race theory, this 1991 text is being blamed basically for a text that just basically said, guess what? Black women have unique experiences as being, because they're both Black and because they're women, have unique experiences that we should think about in their intersectionality, right? And now we're having, so I think it's a good reminder too that every attack on something like critical race theory, which we can say is an attack on Blackness, is also going to be an attack on women. It's going to be an attack on trans people, because they are all deeply interconnected, right? These experiences of marginalization and of difference are always interconnected. So for me, I was politicized at a very, very young age by my dad, who was a former Black Panther. And so from like the youngest possible age, I knew that I was Black, even though I was light, even though I could pass as being not Black in certain situations, I always understood myself to be Black. And when I was in college and people were coming out, surprisingly few, I was in college from 1993 to 1997, so before some of you were born. And people were coming out as gay, they were coming out as lesbian, some of them were coming out as bisexual, very few, even it was a very, very, very liberal school. And I never identified with gay. I identify with parts of gay culture. Like, it's not like I'm like, oh my God, no. And parts of that, I'm sure, at least initially, were my own homophobia. But it was much more that I found, as soon as I heard the word queer, as soon as I read queer theory, I was like, this is much better for me, because it starts from an intersectional space. And there are critiques of the word queer as well, and people who still have problems with that word. But for me, that it represented a kind of, you used the word, Lucky, expanse. There was an expansiveness to queer that was really appealing to me. And so I was always, basically from that time, in like the late 90s on, I always identified as Black and queer. And as a feminist too, because I was also politicized in college early on by a few women who, I'd always, as I said before, I think part of my disidentification with maleness or manness or being a man had to do with just how much I identified with women and with women's experiences, even though I don't, claim to be able to share all of those experiences, but I always understood women's oppression as something that affected everybody, and something that was, needed to be upended. So for me, it was like Black, feminist, queer is like sort of the bedrock of my political sensibility, my political thinking.
Thank you, Shaka. Yeah, I think sometimes, so just for myself, I identify as non-binary and trans and queer, but politically identify as a woman, because I was cultured that way. And so I feel like I am deeply ingrained in womanhood, even though I don't identify with it as a gender. And so I think it's really important to bring this conversation about what we're identifying with, what struggles we can identify with, what other intersectionalities there are, too, that we can, use for like the dismantlement of white capitalism, of the gender binary as an oppressive system, in these kind of things. And so thank you for bringing that up, Shaka. Jay, can you tell us a little bit more about your gender identity and the intersection between other parts of your identity?
Yeah, I would love to. I think that, it's interesting when we talk about gender identity, especially because, well, I guess really gender identity, but even with like intersectionality has been a term that has been hijacked by a lot of white people like myself. Like I'm not, I haven't hijacked it, but as a white person, I acknowledge and own that like people that look like me, that were raised in the same communities as me, that have the same privileges as me. So I have to, that's something that I always just recognize. So whenever we talk about these things, I'm always like, yeah, well, like I can't just talk about intersectionality like as a white person without really recognizing that there's a lot like, and that's on me to help dismantle those conversations, But I guess when it comes to terms of like privilege and power and everything with my transition, I went from really looking like identifying as like this dykey, like butchy, like person who's assigned female at birth, because I never really identified as a lesbian. It never felt right to me. And now here I am as a trans, whatever. But I totally lost where I was going with this one. I had all these thoughts going and it's gone. But it's just, oh, so it's like now I'm read as masculine, right? Even though like I'm read as male, like identify as masculine, sure, in queer spaces, I express myself more. I'll wear like little makeup, I'll dress like whatever and be more me. But at the end of the day, I walk out on the street, I go into classrooms, I teach in schools, and I'm read as male. Sometimes like kids will think that I'm gay, which is like fine, I don't care. But like that little bit of femininity in me comes out, whatever. But like for the most part, I'm seen as male. I go into spaces, I go to a barber shop, they start talking to me like I'm this bro dude, whatever. Like a student asked me if I was an athlete the other day, and I'm holding on to that until I go to the grave because that's the best thing I ever heard, right? So like for me with intersection, right? So like I have all this privilege that like, right? And white people, we did a lot of bad things. Colonization, talking about all that stuff. Like people, my people have caused a lot of harm. And so for me, when it comes to intersectionality and like when we think about like Dr. Crenshaw and all the hard work that she did, it's really that the little things that I do in my life, because it's a burden to carry everything and it's hard to carry everything, but at the same time to recognize that, so it's like, and I love that the sensitive job. Yeah, that's fair. But like I don't know. And like I was raised Jewish, which I think had a huge impact on my identity, especially because I didn't get that Catholic, or I don't understand the differences, but the Catholic, like you're going to hell, like Jews don't believe in hell to begin with. So like when I was like coming out, whatever that looked like, I never was like, oh well, like whatever, like hell seemed cool to me, like it never seemed like a threat. But I think that also was a huge impact, that was a huge privilege in its own to be raised Jewish. And in Judaism and history, there's like third genders, there's like non-binary, there's so many different things that I'm like learning and learning and learning. It's so cool to know that these exist. And at the same time, the reality of the world I live in now, it's just like that I recognize it. If I'm in spaces, if I'm in trans spaces, I'm always like, why? Okay, like I'm here, but like why are there only white people here? Like why aren't there like why aren't even like trans femme people, trans women? That's like, it'll be like a lot of trans mask folks. Like these are things that I'm aware of, and it's like, I try to bring it up. I try to help educate. I educate when I can. I mean, I'm an educator for my job anyway, so it's like kind of my thing. But at the same time, that's what intersectionality to me is, just really like recognizing and owning that, and recognizing the privilege I have in spaces, and using my voice to speak up when I need to. I don't always use it because I like to try to let other folks talk first. But if I see something's like not going right, I'll say what I have to say, kind of thing, because I think it needs to be said. So it's that recognizing it, relearning my life, and relearning how to rewalk through the doors of spaces, how I am read, how I am perceived. Like my boss was like much older than me, and like we would go into spaces sometimes, and like I used to have mask identifying presenting bosses, and they would always talk to them first, but then I would walk into space with her and suddenly they were talking to me like I was the boss, and like things like that, right? So there's a lot of experiences I'm having through life that I'm always learning from. So that's kind of where I'm at. I think that made sense.
It did make sense. I really like what you said, the relearning how to walk into those spaces. Like that really hit me as something important to, bookmark and use in a different place. I'm gonna steal it, Jay. That's what I'm saying. I'm stealing that. And so thinking about walking into new spaces, see, I already did it myself. I wanted to talk about, because we, when WCC as a college, we are really trying to get folks more empowered around their academics and around like their classes, how to talk about gender with other students, talk about gender with their professors, other faculty on the campus. And so I wanted to talk about, and we've been talking about theory a little bit. So I want to talk about, kind of separating again the theory of gender, the theory of queerness, and the lived experience, and think about. I wanted to ask y'all to think about if your identity has ever been questioned or confirmed by an educator, or tell us any specific experience that you felt either empowered or challenged in an educational setting, in a classroom setting. How did that make you feel? What did you do in that scenario? Especially keeping in mind trans students that might be on this call going through these experiences with their faculty right now, whether that be empowering or challenging. And so, I mean, I guess I'm just gonna let you guys pick who goes first.
I'm happy to go. So I'm an academic of gender, a scholar of gender, like I said before. And I think that in my classes, I always seek to empower my students sort of in all kinds of ways. But in particular, I feel like there's no class that I teach where these issues don't come up. And there's no class that I teach that I don't want the students to be, if they're not already feminist, to be feminist by the end of the semester, right? Like I am literally that tenured professor that is the worst nightmare of the right. I'm Black, queer, non-binary, and I will totally recruit. So I don't think, and I think too that, like academics and gender theory and the lived experience of gender aren't separated. So like a term like queer really comes out of the AIDS activism in the 80s and 90s. And queer had been used as a term by people for 100 years already. Like as a term that we would recognize when someone would be like, that person's queer, you would recognize it. You might not go around saying I'm queer, queer nation. You might not go around saying it like in that way, the same kind of identity focused way, but it was still already in circulation. But the activist and the academic, these academic and activist worlds together produced enough like fire that queer becomes a word that some of us start to use like in ordinary life. And then, and of course, then the feedback loop goes the other way as well, right? Like I'm an anthropologist. The main method we have is ethnography, which is basically just like deeply hanging out with people. And so we are supposed to develop our theory, like our innovative theories, our most innovative theories don't come from we're just like sitting like next to the like little fire thinking about abstract things. Like we do that, but the most innovative theories come actually from people's lived experiences. And I think that that is always going to be like, I remember seeing this movie, like it's probably like 10, 15 years old now, The Aggressives. Do you guys remember this movie? It was, and I don't think it's even sort of in circulation, but it basically was like a slice of life, like document of a group of like, we would think of them now as like somewhere on like butch to trans mask spectrum, but still identified as mostly as women. And the term that they used was we're aggressives, which is a pretty cool term. I don't know if it's still in circulation, but it was like, again, like a moment where people's lived experiences could led them to be able to articulate something about their place in the world and their identity. And I think even terms like we use now, like trans mask, trans femme, like opening it up so that trans is like trans asterisk, like trans is this like, is this expanse, is this spectrum. That's really new. That's really new. That's like 10 years maybe, you know? And it's fantastic. Like, I think that keep going into the expanse, you know?
Thank you, Shaka. Yeah, I think about exactly what you said when you were speaking, the like how academics cannot really be torn from queerness and from transness, because our theories are coming from lived experiences. So thank you for sharing that. Lucky, would you like to go next?
Sure, Jade, anything for you. So I am currently a student at the Masters of Social Work program at Columbia University. And the thing about social work spaces, and I also experienced the social work space in my undergraduate program. Social work spaces are spaces that ask that that desire to have this constant flow of learning to adapt to the ever-changing lives of humans and to better serve them. And so it is an expectation for social workers to understand what a trans person is. And I have, being a open, non-binary person throughout my undergraduate degree and throughout now my master's degree, it sort of means a lot to me that I've seen, that I can now see faculty also being part of this gender expanse. And Shaka, that means you too. I appreciate seeing you today. There is no way that I could possibly ever hold my expectations to reality, because they won't be met. You know, even though in these spaces they're supposed to know. Time and time again, I've been disappointed. I've been misgendered. I've been, you know, when people don't understand they, them pronouns, and so they try to put they in spaces where it shouldn't be. Like, yeah, it's when they do that, it's kind of rough. I'm not gonna lie. Like, sure, I'm hurting too, but it's kind of embarrassing for them. It's sort of really, there's this coin that you experience in college. It's a lot of the time it's the first space where individuals are getting the freedom to identify and explore who they are, to expand their queer identities. And so there are these wonderful, wonderful allies in these spaces. And I am one of the lucky ones who, as soon as I entered college, the first person I started talking to was like the best ally like any trans person could ever ask for. Like, she hooked me up with singular housing for like just by myself, didn't have to have a roommate, for gender neutral bathrooms, or really gender inclusive bathrooms, and changed my had her IT friends change my ID to my my real name from my dead name, and even like created like a way for the rosters to have my real name on it instead of my dead name. And so there's this one coin, and we're constantly flipping it. You can either get the wonderful ally with the gender inclusivity, or you can get the disappointment and the hurt and the constant vigilance of academia. And it's that in itself is very tiring.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Lucky. I think just acknowledging that, you know, it's not always a fun time to be a trans person, like spoiler alert. It seems like we're all, you know, kind of vibing together here on this call. And it's really important for us to have these spaces where we can come together and talk about what we're going through and our challenges or our successes in different areas. And I just think it's still so important to hear, you know, we're talking about some successes, but it's still so important to hear the challenges. It's still so important to hear how, even though transness and trans people are becoming more and more visible, that there are still, you know, setbacks. There's still things that feel unnecessary that we have to go through. So thank you, Lucky, for sharing. Jay, can you tell us a little bit about, you know, how you felt empowered or challenged in a classroom setting? And I also just want to acknowledge that it is 4:50 and we have one more question after this. I'll make it a shorter one. It's been like, how the time flies by when you're having fun, you know, celebrate good times. Jay, go ahead.
No pressure on anything. Okay. So for me, so I recently I graduated. So I went to SUNY New Paltz for undergrad and grad school. So I recently in December just finished up my master's program in humanistic and multicultural education, which I would love to talk about. If anybody wants to talk about, I could talk about that forever for another time. However, it's just, I don't know, academic institutions, like we are raised that in order to be somebody in this country, you need to get an education, right? We go through high school, we're trained to be like, all right, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. You're going to do this in college. You're going to do this in college, but they fail to focus on the person. So when someone gets to college, a lot of the times they're lost already, and you're kind of like, what am I supposed to do here? All of these things. So through navigating, really everyone in college is like struggling with something, you know, navigating something. Going into adulthood is scary, regardless of who you are. So like by creating a space for folks that makes it a little bit easier, right? So, and I'm saying this for all your students, you know, because once we like kind of break down this binary, once we break down these expectations of who we're supposed to be as people, we really can create a better space for all of us, right? For all of us to be able to express who we are, to feel comfortable, to be who we feel like we are. So in that aspect, for me, I never stood up to teachers. I never really, I didn't, I found more I found more allyship in grad school than I did in undergrad. However, undergrad wasn't not supportive. But I do recall I did have one professor that I was like, hey, can you call me Jay? And she said, and this was her response was, well, we already have a Jay in our class, so can I just call you dead name? So I said, yeah, because I wasn't gonna fight it. So don't do that, right? Because if there was two Matts in your class, you wouldn't say, okay, well, you have to pick a different name. You know what I like? Or what if there was another like person of my dead name too? You know, like, or what if that wasn't my dead name? What if that was my legal name? Like, there's certain things like that that always will stick with me, right? And it's these little things that like trans folks, if we have to advocate to you, if folks need to advocate things, if people need to do this extra step, but just listen. Like, it's not hard. You don't have to do anything special. Just listen. Like, if you don't get pronouns, own up to it and be like, hey, like, I need help with this. And if the students like Google it, you can Google it, but like, don't rely on trans people to do the work for you. So those are my two little things. I know I'm taking up a lot of time and I know we have another question, but yeah, just coming back to the human of all the students is what I do. That's my educational philosophy, is like we can reach everyone if we take a step back and just help people rethink things. And I think as faculty, as staff, as administration, to rethink back too as well would be really helpful. So that's where I'm at. So
Yeah, thank you, Jay. I'm sorry for
yeah.
putting you on the spot for a second there. Yeah, it's that's so important. First of all, what is that professor's problem? That is ridiculous. Have you ever heard of like a Matt B and like a Matt J? You know, it's like, it's just, there's that you can do different, you just put an initial, whatever. But yeah, I think that's so important to remember here, because we're not just saying students, we're not, you know, there are, for the students who don't feel empowered to you know, challenge their faculty members or their staff members that are putting them in these positions. It's up to us, to us as college professionals, as professionals in whatever field we're in, as a person living in our world, to be like, hey, you can actually be a better person. You can be like a more successful human being if you, you know, just listen to other people and said the name they wanted to be called and said the pronouns and that kind of thing. And so thank you for that. That's really important. I think that really goes right into our last question. And Ernesto, I saw your hand up, but I see that you are going. So thank you for coming in. Thank you for stopping by. I don't know if we'll have time for questions at the end, but we're gonna try our best. But the last question I had was about language. It was about, you know, what do, you know, there's all these words that people are afraid of using. There's pronouns people are afraid of using for some reason. You know, people are like, dude, oh no, you know, girl, oh no, you know, it's like this this verbiage and of, I've heard multiple times people not wanting to talk to a trans person because they didn't want to get their pronouns wrong, which is just, it feels ridiculous. And so I think just as a way of closing, can you folks give me either your advice or just the first thoughts that are coming up in that scenario if someone's like, oh, well, I didn't want to say hi to that person because I didn't want to say dude by accident and then like hurt their feelings, that kind of thinking. What advice do you have for those kind of people, for people who feel that they just don't know how to talk to people, which could be just fine, but it seems that specifically with trans people. Jay, would you mind going first?
Sure. I think that a lot of the times when people are afraid to talk to trans people, and I'm putting that in quotes, or anyone else really, I think you just take a second to step back and really evaluate the situation. Because a lot of times they're making the situation about them and not about the other person. So like, I don't know, it's like chances are you've already spoken to trans people, you've had conversations with trans people. You've probably offended a trans person before. I think we all have, like we're human. I tell everyone that I'm like, we're human. We're born into this society that tells us who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to do things, when we're supposed to do it by, all these different things that we kind of, like I said, we lose that humanness of who we are as people. And I think that like when you limit someone to an identity, like a trans person, okay, I'm trans, yeah, but there's so much more than just being a trans person. There's so much more. Like, it's great. I love it. I love trans people. I love spending time with trans people. Like we get along, we vibe, whatever. And at the same time, like there's so much more to us that than just our pronouns or than just the words we use or what's affirming to us. And it's like, oh, if you don't know someone, like check in, just be like, hey, if you're just meeting someone, be like, hi, my name's Matt and my pronouns are like he, they, he, him, whatever, like whatever your pronouns are. Like if you initiate that conversation, you can check in with folks. Like you don't, like if you're so worried about language, then think about your language, but don't let that impact like your relationship with trans people, because we're really cool. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you, Jay. We are really cool. Shaka, would you like to take us next?
So I checked my email this morning, and I had gotten an email from some people I'd given a talk last week, and there was someone who consistently misgenders me, and I don't care. I honestly don't. I mean, because he's a very sweet person, and he wrote to me and he's like, I'm sorry, I do it, and then I feel terrible, and and he does it in a way that doesn't actually make it about him either, about how bad he feels. It's just like, he's like, I know this is not cool, and I'm sorry, and it just keeps happening. And it's partly because of how I present 85% of the time. I think the thing, in your prompt that you sent us, Jade, you talked about words like dude and girl, or girl, and like dude for me as like a long-term like committed stoner, dude is like a very universal term where anyone is a dude, all things are dudes. This is a dude, this is a dude, everything is a dude. But at the same time, and I think I understand when people might, or I think the same is true for guys, especially in American English, like, hey guys, like what's up? But doesn't mean it's universally true for everyone. And I think part of it too is like, I think to piggyback on what Jay said, was to respect people enough also that if I say dude to someone and they're like, I feel like you're misgendering me, I can not use dude for that person. And I feel confident enough, and like that the people are strong enough in themselves to be like, hey, I don't like that. With girl, it's very interesting. I just want to say something about that, which is that, as I said, I always identified much more with like queer culture, with women's culture. And so there were times in my proximity to gay male culture where that kind of like sisterhood of gay men, where the language of gay men, where you refer to other gay men as she or as girl, there was this time that I really didn't like it. And that though was much more tied to my own homophobia and my own femphobia specifically than it was about, them misgendering me. So I think that these lines are it's so context, it's so context dependent. And it's also like, we're having a conversation in here in the States. This is a totally different conversation in other places where different words have different histories and different meanings, and different resonances, right? Where the trans spectrum is conceived differently. But for me, like, I think I trust people enough to tell me if I say something, and otherwise I just do my best to like respect people. I have a friend whose gender is unclear and I've never asked, like, because they never made it a thing. And so I just, that person is just CJ, and CJ is a dog daddy of unknown gender. And I think that CJ wants it that way. And I'm fine with that,
As someone who knows CJ, I like, yeah, that's exactly, I feel the same way. I think there's this sort of, there's this power in being confusing a little bit, like, in like being like, don't guess, because I know who I am, but you don't have to know. That's not your business. And so I think that's always so important. Lucky, can you wrap us up with this conversation?
Sure. And I'm going to be quick because I know we're over time. We don't even say you see a stranger and their outfit looks very nice. It's probably best that you don't gender strangers. Like, we don't have to gender anything. We can just, if we're talking to someone, you're not gonna refer to them using the third person. There's like, you do not have to include, you don't have to include a gender item. There's no need. And yeah, that's where I'll leave you.
Thank you, Lucky. I mean, short and sweet and to the point. You don't need to gender things, Why is my shoe a man? It doesn't have to be. It doesn't need to be. Sometimes they are, but who knows? I roll with the punches. People are humans above all. Thank you, Dana. And I saw that we had a question from Samara. Dana, would you mind sending that back to me, and so I can share with our panelists, and so if they want to do a write-up of what their thoughts are, just because we're over time and I want to respect everyone's time here. Thank you. And so Samara, saw your question. We will respond to you.
Samara, thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. It's really important. And so we're here. We're at the end of this hour. This has been so wonderful. I'm so thankful and grateful and really honored to be able to share this space with you all. I mean, I'm kind of a cheerleader for all of you. And so it's so nice to kind of like get you all into one space. It's kind of like my evil secret plot, so you guys can all connect. It's really so wonderful to a queer leader. That's exactly with the backwards hat, because I'm still a sensitive jock, like that's exactly what it is. Oh my gosh, wow. Well, we solved it. We solved gender in this talk today. And so thank you for joining us today. Taking all of these. Thank you. If you have any questions, students who are here on the call, or students who are going to see this afterward, you can feel free to email me or email Dana. Our email should be in either the description of this event or the description of the post that's going to be sent out afterwards. And so thank you again. Have a wonderful, wonderful Monday night, and stay warm. And again, thank you for being here and sharing your truth.
It was a pleasure meeting all of you, and I hope our paths